On my return home, I found two French works which Sir H. Lowe had sent to me in the morning, accompanied by a note in which he expressed a hope that their perusal would be gratifying to the Emperor. Will it be credited? One of these works was the Abbé de Pratt's Embassy to Warsaw. This I may note down as Sir Hudson Lowe's first ill-natured trick. The work was a novelty, it is true, but it was a libel, solely directed against Napoleon. As to the other book, when I first saw it, I thought I had found a treasure. I imagined it would indemnify us for the want of the moniteurs and furnish us with the materials we stood so much in need of. Its title described it to be a collection of all the proclamations and official documents of Napoleon as general, first consul, and emperor. But it was published by the libelist Goldsmith and was very complete, the finest bulletins being suppressed, the addresses to the legislative body mutilated. But even in this imperfect state, the collection still remains the noblest monument that any man ever left behind him. After dinner, the emperor amused himself by reading in Goldsmith's publications some of his own proclamations to the army of Italy. They even produced a powerful impression on himself. They interested and excited him. And yet, said he, they had the impudence to say, I could not write. He then turned to his proclamations to the army of Egypt and joked much about that one, in which he represented himself as inspired and sent by God. This was quackery, said he, but it was quackery of the highest order. Besides, the proclamation was composed only for the purpose of being translated into high-flown Arabic verse by one of the cleverest of the sheiks. My French troops, continued he, merely laughed at it. And such was their disposition in this respect that in order to induce them to listen to the bare mention of religion, I was myself obliged to speak very lightly on the subject, to place Jews besides Christians and rabbis besides bishops. The assertion made by Goldsmith of Napoleon's having assumed the Mussulman dress is totally false. If ever he entered a mosque, he said, it was always as a conqueror and not as a worshipper. On this subject, I refer the reader to the campaigns of Egypt. He was a too serious deterrent and had too much self-respect to act in an equivocal way on this point. After all, continued he gaily, it would not have been so very extraordinary, given those circumstances, had induced me to embrace Islamism. And as the good Queen of France once said, you will tell me as much, but I must have had good reason for my conversion. I must have been secure of advancing as far as the Euphrates, at least. Change of religion for private interest is inexcusable, but it may be pardoned in consideration of immense political results. Henry IV said, Paris is well worth the mass. Will it then be said that the dominion of the East and perhaps the subjugation of all Asia were not worth a turban and a pair of trousers? And in truth, the whole matter was reduced to this, for the grand sheiks had studied how to render it easy to us. They had smoothed down the greatest obstacles, allowed us the use of wine, and dispensed with all corporeal formalities. We should therefore have lost only our small clothes and hats. I say we, for the army and the disposition in which it then was, would have entertained but few scruples on the subject, and would have made it a mere matter of jest and laughter. But what would have been the consequence? I should have turned my back on Europe, and the old civilization of the continent would have been bound up, and who would then have troubled themselves about the course of fate in France, or the regeneration of the age? Who would have attempted it? Who could have succeeded? Continuing his examination of Goldsmith's book, the emperor by chance cast his eyes on the act of the consuls, by which General Latour Froissac was cashiered for the surrender of Mantua. This, said the emperor, was without doubt an illegal and tyrannical act, but it was a necessary evil. It was the fault of the laws. The general was 100,000 times guilty, and yet it was doubtful whether we ought to have condemned him. His acquittal would have produced most fatal effect. We therefore struck the blow with the combined arms of honor and opinion. But I say again, it was a tyrannical act, one of those severe strokes which is sometimes indispensably necessary in a great nation and under important circumstances. 27. About 2 o'clock, The governor came to Longwood and asked the emperor's leave to summon all the domestics before him. This was the first insult received from the governor. He probably wished to ascertain whether the declarations had been spontaneously made. Monsieur de Monttalon, who had the superintendence of the servants, informed Sir Hudson Lowe in the emperor's name that His Majesty had not imagined there could have been any pretense for interference between him and his valet de chambre. That if his permission were asked, he decidedly refused it. That if the governor's instructions required the adoption of this measure, the power was in his own hands, and he might use it. This would only be adding another outrage to those which the English ministers had already accumulated upon him. At this moment, I joined Monsieur de Monttalon and the governor. I could easily perceive that the two interlocutors were by no means pleased with each other. After a few moments of silence and evident dissatisfaction, the governor turned to me and remarked that pains seemed to be taken to create difficulties and embarrassments in all that regarded the emperor. I observed that Napoleon's household having been appointed for him and not being one of his choice, it was perfectly natural that he should object to any interference with the servants. That if the governor had any doubts to clear up relative to the domestics, two courses were open to him. He might resort to indirect and underhand means, which at least would not wound our feelings, or he might employ force and severity, which he was authorized to do if he pleased, and therefore he need entertain no scruples on the subject. But I added that the method he was pursuing was quite hostile to our habits. I assured him that the emperor was desirous of being as accommodating as possible in the new situation in which he was placed, that he wished to retire within himself, asking for nothing, but to be left unannoyed, to feel and consume his sorrow, that fortune had indeed robbed him of his power, but that nothing could deprive him of his self-respect, and finally that the consciousness and the delicacy of his dignity were the only things that remained to him of which he was perfectly master. Meanwhile, the servants were assembled, and Monsieur de Monttalon and I withdrew, that we might not sanction such a measure by our presence. The governor spoke to the domestics and afterwards joined us, saying, I am now satisfied. I can inform the English government that they all signed it freely and voluntarily. But his ill humor was not yet fully spent, for he began most inopportunely to extol the beautiful situation of Longwood, observing that after all we were not so badly off. And when we remarked that we felt most severely the want of shade in this burning climate, and that there was scarcely a single tree on the island, "Oh, we will plant some," said he. Could anything have been more cutting? This may be recorded as the first trait of brutality on the part of the governor. After this, he took his leave. About 5 o'clock, the emperor got into the carriage to take an airing. As we were going out, he said, "Gentlemen, but for one man, I should have been master of the world." And who do you think this one man was? We were all eagerness to know. The Abbé de Prat, continued the emperor, the almoner of the god of war. On hearing this, we could not repress our laughter. I am serious, continued he. The Abbé thus expresses himself in his Embassy to War, so you may read it yourselves. The work is altogether a wicked attack on me, an absolute libel, overwhelming me with insults and calumnies. Whether I happened to be in a particularly good humor at the time, or whether it was because only truth offends, I know not. But, at all events, I laughed heartily when I read the work, and it afforded me abundant entertainment. Misunderstandings occasionally occurred between two individuals of the emperor's suite. This circumstance should not have been mentioned here, but that it serves to introduce some characteristic traits of the mind and hearts of him to whom we are devoted. The newspapers of the time and the return of one of the parties to Europe in consequence of these misunderstandings, however, have already given publicity to the affair. When I entered the drawing room to wait until the announcement of dinner, I found the emperor speak with the utmost warmth on this subject, which vexed him exceedingly. His language was energetic and moving. "You followed me," said he, "with the view of cheering my captivity. Be united, then. Otherwise, you but annoy me. If you wish to render me happy, be united. Otherwise, you are but a torment to me. You talk of fighting. Even before my very eyes, I am no longer then the object of your attention. You forget that the observation of foreigners is fixed upon you. I wish you all to be animated by my spirit. I wish that every individual around me should be happy and share the few enjoyments that remain yet to us. Even down to little Emmanuel there, I should wish you all to have your due share. The announcement at dinner put an end to the reprimand. The emperor was silent during the repast, but at the dessert he ordered Voltaire to be brought to him and began to read some of his dramas. But he soon laid aside the books. We daily became more and more tired of Voltaire. The emperor retired very early and soon after desired me to attend him into his bedchamber, where I remained with him until late hour. The 28th, the emperor again recurred to the Abbé de Prat and his work, which he reduced to merely the first and last pages. In the first, said he states himself to be the only man who arrested Napoleon's career. In the last, he shows that the emperor, in his way back from Moscow, dismissed him from the embassy, which is true, and this fact, his self-love, would fain misrepresent a revenge. This is the whole work. But the Abbé continued. The emperor did not fulfill at Warsaw any of the objects which had been intended. On the contrary, he did a great deal of mischief. Reports against him poured in upon me from every quarter. Even the young men, the clerks attached to the embassy, were surprised at his conduct and went so far as to accuse him of maintaining an understanding with the enemy, which, however, I by no means believed. But he certainly had a long conversation with me, which he misrepresents, as might be expected. And it was at the very moment when he was delivering a long, prosing speech, which appeared to me a mere string of absurdity and impertinence, that I scrawled on the corner of the chimney-piece the order to withdraw him from the embassy and to send him as soon as possible to France, a circumstance which was the cause of a good deal of merriment at the time, and which the Abbé seems very desirous of concealing. I cannot refrain from transcribing from the embassy to Warsaw M. de Prat's account of the Emperor Napoleon's court at Dresden. His remarks on this subject are striking and afford a faithful picture both of men and things at that period. Here he says, who wished to form a just idea of the omnipotence exercised in Europe by the Emperor Napoleon, who wished to fathom the depths of terror into which almost every European sovereign has fallen, transport yourselves in imagination to Dresden, and there contemplate that superb prince at the period of his highest glory, so nearly bordering on his fall. The emperor occupied the grand apartments of the chateau, whither he had transferred a considerable portion of his household. Here he gave grand dinner parties, and with the exception of the first Sunday when the King of Saxony had a gala, Napoleon's parties were always attended by the sovereigns and different members of their families according to the invitations issued by the Grand Marshal of the palace. Some private individuals were admitted on these occasions. I enjoyed that honor on the day of my appointment to the embassy of Warsaw. The emperor's levees were held there, as at the Tuileries at 9 o'clock. Then, with what timid submission did a crowd of princes, mingling with the courtiers, and often scarcely perceived among them, anxiously await the moment for presenting themselves before the new arbitrator of the destinies. These passages and some others of equal truth and beauty of diction are lost amidst a heap of details full of misrepresentation and malice. They are distorted facts and mutilated conversations, said the emperor, and adverting to the accounts of the Empress of Austria, which were filled with adulation, and of the Emperor Alexander, whose amiable virtues and brilliant qualifications are extolled by the author to the detriment of Napoleon. Surely, exclaimed the emperor, this is not a French bishop, but an Eastern magi, a worshipper of the rising sun. I shall both now and henceforward suppress from a feeling of justice several other articles in many details. The following observations may, however, be noted down in opposition to the Abbé de Prat's endeavors to prove that the French were the unjust aggressors in the contest with Russia. The emperor, speaking of the Russian war, said, no offense or trifling with regard to nations and sovereigns, for their destinies are controlled by the most inconsiderable circumstances. For some time, a misunderstanding had risen up between France and Russia. France reproached Russia with the violation of the continental system, and Russia required an indemnification for the Duke of Oldenburg and raised other pretensions. Russian troops were approaching the Duchy of Warsaw, and a French army is forming in the north of Germany, yet we were far from being determined on war. when all on a sudden a new Russian army commenced its march towards the duchy, and as an ultimatum, an insolent note was presented at Paris by the Russian ambassador, who, in the event of its non-acceptance, threatened to quit Paris in 8 days. I considered this as a declaration of war. It was long since I had been accustomed to this sort of tone. I was not in the habit of allowing myself to be anticipated. I could have marched to Russia at the head of the rest of Europe. The enterprise was popular. The cause was one which interested France and Europe. It was the last effort that remained to France. Her fate and that of the new European system depended on the struggle. Russia was the last resource of England. The peace of the whole world rested with Russia. The event could not be doubtful. I commenced my march, but when I reached the frontier, I, to whom Russia had declared war by withdrawing her ambassador, still considered it my duty to send my Lauriston to the Emperor Alexander at Vilna. He was rejected, and the war commenced. Yet, who would credit it? Alexander and myself were in a situation of two bullies who, without wishing to fight, were endeavoring to terrify each other. I would most willingly have maintained peace. I was surrounded and overwhelmed with unfavorable circumstances, and all that I have since learned convinces me that Alexander was still less eager for war than myself. Monsieur de Romansov, who had maintained communications at Paris, and who some time after, when the Russians experienced reverses, was very severely treated by Alexander for the course he had induced him to pursue, had assured the Russian emperor that the moment was come when Napoleon, in his embarrassments, would readily make some sacrifices to avoid war, that the favorable opportunity should not be allowed to escape, that it was only necessary to assume a bold attitude and a tone of firmness, that indemnity would be obtained for the Duke of Oldenburg, that Danzig would be gained, and that Russia would thus acquire immense weight in Europe. Such was the cause of the movement of the Russian troops and of the insolent note of Prince Kurakin, who doubtless was not in on the secret and who had been foolish enough to execute his instructions in too literal a way. The same mistaken notions and the same system also occasioned the refusal to receive Lauriston at Vilna. This was an instance of the errors and misfortunes which attended my new diplomacy. It stood insulated, without affinity or contact, in the midst of the objects which it had to direct. Had my Minister for Foreign Affairs been a member of the old aristocracy and a man of superior ability, there is no doubt but he must have observed the cloud that was gathering and might have prevented our going to war. Talleyrand perhaps might have done this, but it was above the powers of the new school. I could not make the discovery myself. My dignity precluded personal explanations. I could form a judgment only from documents, and in vain did I turn them over and over, for I was sure at last to arrive at a point where they could make no reply to my inquiries. Scarcely had I opened the campaign when the mask fell and the real sentiments of the enemy were developed. In the course of 2 or 3 days, Alexander, alarmed at our first successes, dispatched a messenger to me to say that if I would evacuate the invading territory and fall back as far as Neon, he would enter upon negotiations. But I, in my turn, took this for a stratagem. I was elated with success. I had taken the Russian army in the very fact, in the critical moment, I had cut off migration, and I might have hoped to destroy him. I saw, however, that the enemy merely wanted to gain time for the purpose of rallying his forces. Had I been convinced of Alexander's sincerity, I should doubtless have acceded to his proposition of falling back to the Niemen. In that case, he would not have passed to Vienna. Vilna would have been neutralized, and there Alexander and myself, accompanied by a few battalions of our guards, would have negotiated in person. How many arrangements should I not have proposed? Alexander would have had only to take his choice, and we should have separated good friends. Yet, in spite of the events that succeeded and which left my enemies triumphant, it is quite certain that the measures I have just hinted at would have been less advantageous to those which have since been pursued. Alexander marched to Paris, it is true, but he came accompanied by the forces of all Europe. He has gained Poland, but what will be the result of the shock given to the whole European system, of the agitation into which every nation has been thrown, of the increased European influence over the rest of Russia through the accumulation of new acquisitions, expeditions in which the Russian troops are engaged in remote quarters, and the influence of the incongruous mass of men and knowledge which have taken refuge in Russia from foreign parts. Will the Russian sovereigns be content to consolidate what they have acquired? If so, in the contrary, they should be influenced by ambition. What extravagant enterprises may they not attempt? And yet they have lost Moscow, her wealth and resources, and those in many other cities. Those are wounds which will bleed for half a century. But at Vilna, we might have entered into arrangements for the advantage of all subjects, as well as sovereigns. On another occasion, the emperor said, I might have shared with Russia the possession of the Turkish Empire. We had oftener than once contemplated the idea. But Constantinople was always the obstacle that opposed its execution. The Turkish capital was the grand stumbling block between us. Russia wanted it, and I could not resign it. Constantinople is an empire of itself. It is the real keystone of power, for he who possesses it may rule the world. What then, said the emperor, resuming the former question, what has Alexander gained, which he might not have secured to better advantage at Vilna? Someone present replied, Sire, he is conquered, and he remains triumphant. That may be the vulgar opinion, exclaimed the emperor, but no sovereign should entertain such an idea. A monarch, if he himself governs, or his counselors, if they govern for him, must in a vast enterprise of this nature attach less importance to the victory than to its results. And even though the case be limited to vulgar consideration, still I maintain that the wished-for object has not been attained. Even here the palm must be awarded to the vanquished party, who will pretend that my victories in Germany were equaled by the successes of the Allies in France. Will any thinking man, will any historian pronounce such an opinion? The Allies advanced with all Europe in their train against a force which might be almost counted as nothing. They had 600,000 men in the line and nearly an equal number in reserve. If they had been beaten, they had nothing to fear. They could have fallen back. I, on the contrary, in Germany, 500 leagues from home, had hardly a force equal to my enemies. I was surrounded by sovereigns and people repressed only by fear, and who, on the first disaster, were ready to rise against me. But I triumphed amidst dangers constantly increasing. I was incessantly compelled to exercise an equal degree of address and energy. In all these enterprises, I found it necessary to maintain a strange character, to evince singular acuteness of perception and great confidence in my own plans, though they were perhaps disapproved by everyone around me. What deeds on the part of the Allies can be compared with these? If I had not conquered at Austerlitz, I should have had all Prussia on me. If I had not proved victorious at Jena, Austria and Spain would have assailed me in my rear. If I had not triumphed at Wagram, which, by the by, was a less decisive victory, I had to fear that Russia would abandon me, but that Prussia would rise against me. And meanwhile, the English were ready before Antwerp. Yet, what was my conduct after the victory at Austerlitz? I gave Alexander his liberty, though I might have made him a prisoner. After Jena, I left the House of Prussia in possession of a throne which I had conquered. After Wagram, I neglected to parcel out the Austrian monarchy. If all this be attributed merely to magnanimity, cold and calculating politicians will doubtless blame me, but without rejecting that sentiment to which I am not a stranger. I had higher aims in view. I wished to bring about the amalgamation of the great European interests in the same manner as I had effected the union of parties in France. My ambition was one day to become the arbiter in the great cause of nations and kings. It was therefore necessary that I should secure to myself claims on their gratitude and seek to render myself popular among them. This I could not do without losing something in the estimation of others. I was aware of this, but I was powerful and fearless. I concerned myself but little about transient popular murmurs. Being very sure that the result would infallibly bring the people over to my side, I committed a great fault after the Battle of Wagram in not reducing the power of Austria still more. She remained too strong for our safety, and to her we must attribute our ruin. The day after the battle, I should have made known by proclamation that I would treat with Austria only on condition of the preliminary separation of the three crowns of Austria, Hungary, and Bohemia. Will it be credited? A prince of the House of Austria several times hinted to me the idea of transferring one of the two last mentioned crowns to him, or even raising him to the throne occupied by his own family on pretense that it was only thus that Austria could be induced to act sincerely with me. He even proposed to give me, by way of hostage, blank, and moreover every possible guarantee. The emperor said he had even turned this idea over in his own mind. He had hesitated about it for some time previous to his marriage with Maria Louisa, but after that event, continued he, it became impracticable. He observed that on the subject of marriage his notions were too citizen-like. Austria, said he, had become a portion of my own family, and yet my marriage ruined me. If I had not thought myself safe and protected by this alliance, I should have delayed the resurrection of Poland. I should have waited until Spain was subdued and tranquil. I set my foot on an abyss, concealed by a bed of flowers. The 29th. About 5 o'clock, the Grand Marshal visited me in my chamber. He had not been able to see the Emperor, who, through indisposition, had been confined to his own apartment all day, and refused to see anyone. Towards evening, I went out to take a stroll in those paths in which the Emperor usually walked about this time. I felt dull, being alone. We had dined without the Emperor. About 9 o'clock, just as I was regretting that the day had passed over without my seeing him, he sent for me. I expressed my concern for his indisposition. He replied that he was perfectly well, but that he had taken a fancy to remain alone, that he had been reading all day, and that the time had passed away swiftly and agreeably. He ever appeared low-spirited and languid. He took my atlas, which happened to be lying beside him, and opening it at the map of the world, he cast his eye on Persia. I had laid out some excellent plans with regard to that country, said he. What a happy resting point would it have been for my lever, whether I wished to disturb Russia or to make an incursion on India. I had set on foot relations with Persia, and I hoped to bring them to a point of intimacy as well as those of Turkey. It might have been supposed that the animals would have understood their own interests sufficiently well to have acceded to my propositions, but both Persians and Turks evaded me at the decisive moment. English gold proved more powerful than my plans. Some treacherous ministers for a few guineas sacrificed the prosperity of their country, which is usually the case under seraglio monarchs or imbecile kings. The emperor, then abandoning politics, began to relate some anecdotes of the seraglio and reverted to the Persians of Montesquieu and his letters, which he said were distinguished for wit, delicate observations, and above all for the bitter satire of the time. He afterwards spoke of the Turkish and Persian ambassadors who were in Paris during his reign. He asked me what impression they produced in the French capital, whether they made visits and received company, etc. I replied that during their stay in Paris they engrossed public attention and formed a kind of raree show at court. The Persian, in particular, attracted curiosity. On his arrival, he willingly received visitors, and as he made presents of perfumes and even shawls, he was a great favorite with the ladies. But the late, great number of those who paid their court to him soon forced him to set bounds to his liberality, and thenceforward, the rage being over, he was no longer thought of. I added that at court, when the emperor was not present, we sometimes ventured, very inconsiderately to be sure, to play tricks at the expense of the Oriental ambassadors. At a concert given one day by the Empress Josephine, Askar Khan, with his long painted beard, was one of the company. He seemed to be heartily tired of the music and fell asleep standing with his back against a wall, his feet thrust forward and resting against an armchair which stood in the corner by the fireplace. Someone, by way of a joke, drew the chair away softly so that his excellency had well nigh fallen down his whole length on the floor. And being thus roused from his slumber, he roared out lustily. Askar Khan could more readily enter into a joke than the Turkish ambassador, but on this occasion he was thrown much out of humor, and as we could only understand each other by gestures, the scene was most ludicrous. In the evening, the empress inquired the cause of the noise that had been heard during the concert, and when the circumstances was explained to her, she laughed and scolded us a good deal. It was very ill done, certainly, observed the emperor, but what business had he at the concert? Sire, I replied, both he and the Turkish ambassador went there with the view of paying their court to you. They hoped that your majesty would be apprised of the circumstance, though you were at the time 500 leagues off. I added that on another occasion. They had both proved themselves accomplished courtiers, and that their wish to ingratiate themselves with the emperor carried them to the most extravagant lengths. We have often seen them, said I, at the close of the grand diplomatic audiences on Sunday, follow your majesty to Mass and occupy the pews in the chapel along with cardinals of the Holy Catholic Church. What a monstrous spectacle, exclaimed the emperor. What a subversion of their principles and habits. What extraordinary things I brought about. And yet all this was neither ordered nor observed. The conversation continuing on the two Orientals, I mentioned that I had been informed the Arch-Chancellor Cambacerius once gave them both a grand dinner, though natives of the same quarter of the globe and members of the same religion. Yet they nevertheless evinced shades of character totally different. The Turk, who was a disciple of Omar, was the Janist, and the Persian, who was a secretary of Ali, was the Jesuit. It was said that at Cambaceri's dinner they scrupulously watched each other with regard to the wine, just as two Catholic bishops seated at the same table might be expected to keep a vigilant lookout lest either should be tempted to eat meat on a Friday. The Turk was gloomy and ignorant and was looked upon as little better than a brute, but the Persian possessed literary information, was very talkative, and had the reputation of being a clever man. It was observed that he made no use of a knife and fork, either in eating or helping himself to any dish at table, and he probably would not have hesitated to help his neighbors in the same unceremonious way. One of our customs particularly attracted his notice. This was our practice of eating bread with every dish. He said he could not understand why we were obliged to always eat the same thing with everything. I believe I have already remarked that nothing amuses the empress so much as accounts of the fashionable world in Paris. Anecdotes of our saloons. The emigrants in the Faubourg Saint-Germain were subjects on which he was always fond of conversing with me when we were alone, and he accounted for this by saying to me once, I was well acquainted with everything that had relation to myself, but I never knew anything of those affairs. He observed that he had a natural desire to learn everything that was passing near him and to hear the chit-chat of little towns. I heard a great deal on these subjects, added he, during the period of my power. But whenever anything favorable was said, I put myself on my guard. I was fearful of insinuations, and if, on the contrary, anything unfavorable was reported to me, I mistrusted the accusation and had enough to do to guard against a feeling of contempt. Here, my dear Las Casas, none of these disadvantages exist. You and I already belong to the other world. We are conversing in the Elysian fields. You are without interested views, and I am without suspicion. I therefore eagerly seized every opportunity that offered itself to entertain the emperor in this way. He perceived this and gave me credit for my intentions, for at the conclusion of one of my stories, he pinched my ear and said in a tone of voice which delighted me, I read a story in your atlas of a northern monarch who was immured in a prison, and one of his soldiers solicited and obtained permission to be imprisoned with him in order that he might cheer his spirits, either by inducing him to converse or by relating amusing stories to him. My dear Las Casas, you are that soldier. On the present occasion, I described to the emperor the hoax which had been played upon Monsieur de Marbois, and which he had not heard of before. It was as follows. One day, as the story goes, Askar Khan, who was indisposed and tired of his Persian treatment, gave orders to send for Monsieur Bourdois, one of the first physicians in Paris. The messenger made a mistake and went to Monsieur de Marbois, ex-minister of the Treasury and at that time president of the Court of Accounts. His Excellency, the Persian ambassador, said he is very ill and wishes to see you. Monsieur de Marbois could not conceive what business the Persian ambassador could possibly have with him, but Askar Khan was the envoy of a great prince, and there is nothing which vanity will not contrive to reconcile. He proceeded with great pomp to the ambassador's residence, and it must be allowed that there is nothing in his dress, physiognomy, or deportment at all likely to undeceive the Persian, who, as soon as he saw him, thrust out his tongue, and stretching forth his arm, motioned him to feel his pulse. These extraordinary gestures astonished Monsieur de Marbois, but he thought they might be some oriental fashion. He took the hand which was offered and pressed it cordially when four attendants entered with solemnity and presented to the ex-minister a vessel of a very unequivocal nature for his better information on the state of the patient. At this spectacle, the grave Monsieur de Marbois flew into a violent passion and asked what was the meaning of this extraordinary behavior. The mistake was explained. It was Monsieur Bourdois who had been wanted, and the similarity in the sound of the two names had alone occasioned the error. Poor Monsieur de Marbois was the laughingstock of Paris, and for a long time he could not show his face anywhere without exciting merriment. The drawing rooms of Paris are indeed tremendous with their jokes at the emperor, for it cannot be denied that they are, for the most part, pointed and witty. They always assail the enemy at the breach, and a total defeat is the usual consequence. It is true, said I, nothing was spared. Even religion was not held sacred, and your majesty may well suppose that neither you nor the empress escaped. I dare say not, replied the emperor, but no matter what was said of us. It was reported, sire, that one day your majesty, being much dissatisfied at the perusal of a dispatch from Vienna, said to the empress in a moment of ill humor, your father's a blockhead. Votre père est une ganache. Maria Louisa, who was unacquainted with many French phrases, turned to the person nearest her and, observing that the emperor had called her father a ganache, asked what the term meant. The courtier, embarrassed at this unexpected interrogatory, stammered out that the word signified a wise man, a man of judgment, and a good counselor. Some time after, the empress, with her newly learned term fresh in her memory, was present at the council of state, and the discussion becoming somewhat warm, in order to put a stop to it, she called on Monsieur Cambaceres, who was yawning by her side. You must set us right on this important point, said she. You shall be our oracle, for I consider you as the greatest ganache in the empire. As these words, the emperor held his sides with laughter. What a pity, said he, that this anecdote is not true. Only imagine the scene, the offended dignity of Cambaceres, the merriment of the whole council, and the embarrassment of poor Maria Louisa, alarmed at the success of her unconscious joke. The conversation continued for a long time in this way, and I spent about 2 hours with the emperor. I had exerted myself to talk as much as I possibly could to divert him, and I had succeeded. The emperor felt his spirits revived. He even enjoyed a hearty laugh. When he dismissed me, he felt much better, and I was happy at the change.